When the 1870s opened, a 31-year-old in Cleveland held a modest slice of America's oil refining business, something like 4% by most estimates. A decade later, the slice had become the whole pie, with Standard Oil sitting near 90% and acting less like a firm than like a private ministry of energy. By 1904, the dominance reached beyond refining into production, pricing, transport, and final distribution, so deeply that the industry's competition could move only inside boundaries he set. His name was John D. Rockefeller, and the reason he still matters in 2025 is not nostalgia for kerosene or black and white robber baron mythology. The reason he matters is that he engineered a repeatable system, and systems survive even when the original company is forced to die. If you're interested in personal finance, hit subscribe and give this video a like right now. And now, let's move on. People often talk about Standard Oil as if it were a monster that the government eventually slain in 1911, after which life returned to normal. That story is comforting because it suggests monopolies are temporary errors that courts can simply correct. The harsher argument is that Standard Oil was never the true danger because Standard Oil was only the first successful deployment of a blueprint. Once the blueprint exists, it can be applied to any market where scale matters, where logistics can be weaponized, and where regulation can be shaped. That is why the claim here is so uncomfortable. You do not live under Standard Oil's name, but you do live under Rockefeller's method, because the method became standard practice for dominant corporations over the next 150 years. Look at the ordinary routines that define modern life, and the pattern shows up. You buy fuel from a small set of giants operating like an oligopoly, many of them descendants of the very pieces Standard Oil became. You order goods through platforms whose warehouses, shipping networks, and payment systems are so integrated that rivals depend on them while competing against them. You search for information through services whose dominance is reinforced by network effects, defaults, and data collection rather than by a visible price tag. You take medicines inside a healthcare pipeline shaped by licensing, standards, patents, and regulator relationships that can function like barriers to entry. You borrow, save, or swipe a card through financial systems, structured as layered holding companies, designed to be indispensable and hard to police. These are not identical industries, yet they rhyme because the same strategic grammar keeps reappearing. Own the chain, thin the field, shape the rules, and buy public legitimacy. That is why understanding Rockefeller is framed as a survival skill rather than a history lesson. The system he normalized is excellent at extracting value quietly because it converts necessity into revenue and converts revenue into further control. It also hides in plain sight because it delivers real convenience, lower unit prices, and the feeling that consumers are freely choosing among brands. Once you learn the blueprint, you stop arguing about whether one CEO is good or bad, and you start watching the structural moves that create inevitability. To see the blueprint clearly, you have to watch it being built. Rockefeller's early choices, the tactics that turned efficiency into a weapon, the legal architecture that concentrated control, the breakup that was supposed to punish him, and the later evolution that made the method stronger than the original company ever was. John Davidson Rockefeller was born on July 8, 1839, in Richford, New York, and the story frames his upbringing as a collision of two forces that later fused into his business personality. His father was a roaming hustler, a man who ran schemes and sold fake cures, training the household in manipulation and moral flexibility by example. His mother was a strict Baptist, committed to discipline, thrift, and the conviction that hard work and order were righteous. The narrative argues that Rockefeller absorbed the father's cold practicality and the mother's moral certainty, then welded them into a peculiar combination. He could behave with ruthless aggression while believing sincerely that he was doing something virtuous. In his worldview, monopoly was not automatically immoral if it reduced chaos, improved efficiency, and organized an industry for the public good, because he treated disorder as waste and waste as sin. When oil was discovered in Titusville, Pennsylvania in 1859, the country stepped into a boom that resembled a fever dream. Drillers poured into western Pennsylvania, prices whipsawed violently, and the business behaved like a casino disguised as industry. Overproduction crashed prices, then shortages spiked them, and fortunes appeared and vanished with terrifying speed. Many men chased riches by drilling because the image of striking oil felt like the purest American gamble. Rockefeller, still very young and working in Cleveland, looked at drilling and saw volatility that could not be engineered away. He looked at refining and saw a bottleneck that could be engineered because crude oil did not become widely valuable until it was turned into kerosene and other usable products. Instead of betting on a well, he bet on the step everyone eventually needed, the step that could be standardized, scaled, and controlled. In 1863, he put around $4,000 into his first refinery in Cleveland, and within a couple of years, it had become the city's largest operation. That achievement mattered, but Cleveland at the time had dozens of refineries, and the industry's economics were brutal. Many refiners survived on thin margins, relied on credit, and could be erased by one bad price swing or one transport disruption. Rockefeller's defining move, as the narrative tells it, was that he did not plan to compete better within that environment. He planned to change the environment so that competition became temporary, a phase that would collapse once his organization reached a certain scale. He treated the market as something that could be redesigned, and he built a machine that turned cost advantage into a form of coercion. The machine's first major component was vertical integration, which is just a formal way of saying Rockefeller refused to remain a specialist trapped inside someone else's supply chain. Most refiners bought crude from drillers, bought barrels from barrel makers, paid railroads for shipment, rented storage, and depended on distributors for final sales. Every link took a slice of profit, and every link created dependence, because if a rail line raised rates or a barrel supplier tightened terms, the refiner's margins could collapse overnight. Rockefeller decided those external profit centers would become internal departments, because dependence meant vulnerability, and vulnerability meant being at someone else's mercy. He moved into barrel manufacturing so he could control packaging costs. He invested in tank cars and negotiated transport leverage. He expanded storage and warehousing to control timing, and he pushed into distribution so the margin at the end of the chain did not flow to someone outside his system. This integration produced the kind of advantage that sounds like efficiency in a textbook, but acts like a weapon in the real world. If Rockefeller could make barrels cheaper than rivals could buy them, the difference became a permanent cost gap. If he could ship more cheaply through preferential arrangements, that gap could be widened until competitors were forced to sell at a loss just to remain visible. The narrative emphasizes railroads because rail was the circulatory system of the oil business, and whoever controlled terms of shipment effectively controlled who could profit. Rockefeller negotiated secret rebates and preferential rates that lowered Standard Oil's costs while raising competitors' effective costs, turning the same infrastructure into a tilted playing field. A competitor could refine as well as Rockefeller and still lose simply because the logistics math was rigged and Rockefeller's scale allowed him to sustain that rigging. By 1870, he formalized his growing operation into the Standard Oil Company of Ohio, and even then, he still held only a minority portion of national refining. He treated that share as a starting point rather than a destination, because a partial share still leaves room for rivals to grow into threats. The second component of his machine was horizontal consolidation, meaning the systematic reduction of competitors through acquisition, intimidation, and economic demolition. The narrative uses the 1872 episode later, labeled the Cleveland Massacre, as a clean demonstration of the method. Rockefeller approached refinery owners and offered to buy them, often at terms that looked fair, and sometimes with an offer to keep them involved as managers inside the larger system. On the surface, it looked like friendly consolidation, but the friendliness functioned as an ultimatum because refusal triggered punishment. When owners said no, Rockefeller drove kerosene prices down, sometimes below cost, and he could survive the loss because his integrated costs were lower and his reserves were deeper. Independent refiners, already operating on thin margins, could not bleed for long before creditors cut them off. They faced a brutal choice between taking Rockefeller's offer and going bankrupt. And the narrative stresses that the logic was designed so surrender looked rational. Within a short period, Rockefeller controlled nearly every refinery in Cleveland, turning local dominance into a platform for national expansion. The script's larger point is that this sequence became the monopoly template: present an acquisition as a reasonable exit, punish resistance with a price war that targets the competitor's financial endurance, then acquire the remains at a discount. Once you can do this repeatedly, Competition becomes something you manage rather than something you fear. Through the 1870s, Rockefeller repeated the pattern across the country, expanding Standard Oil into other refining centers and applying the same pressures. Vertical integration lowered his internal costs, preferential transport deals tilted logistics, and price wars broke independent resistance. By 1879, Standard Oil controlled around 90% of America's refining capacity, a number so high it stops feeling like market leadership and starts feeling like private governance. At that level, a company can influence not only prices, but also who gets access to crucial infrastructure, who receives stable supply, and who is forced into dependency. Public opinion turned sharply against Rockefeller, and he became the emblem of the robber baron, a man accused of crushing livelihoods to accumulate wealth. Rockefeller understood that extreme dominance produces two predictable counterattacks: legal challenge and political hatred. A hated monopoly becomes a convenient target for lawmakers and journalists, and once the public wants punishment, law tends to follow. Rockefeller's response was not primarily PR, it was architecture. He needed a structure that allowed centralized control across state lines, insulated the leadership from direct operational liability, and made the empire harder to dismantle. The narrative presents the trust as his most important legal invention, because it solved these problems by separating ownership and control from the visible operating companies. In 1882, Standard Oil's lawyers created the Standard Oil Trust, a mechanism that held the stock of multiple Standard Oil entities and centralized power in a small group of trustees. The controlling structure did not need to refine a barrel. It merely needed to own and direct those who did. This design matters because it made the true center of power harder to target. When control sits above production, regulators can attack one operating unit while the controlling entity remains intact and can rearrange assets elsewhere. The narrative draws a straight line from the trust to the modern holding company, the parent that owns subsidiaries, isolates liability, shifts assets, and complicates enforcement because the corporation is no longer one body, but a constellation. In this framing, Rockefeller did not just beat competitors. He engineered a legal form that later industries could copy even when they had nothing to do with oil. Once the form exists, it spreads through corporate law and boardrooms because it offers durability, flexibility, and defensive complexity. By the early 20th century, Standard Oil's share of refining and final sales reached levels that made Rockefeller the era's defining fortune, with later inflation-adjusted comparisons often placing his wealth beyond modern billionaires. That wealth did not appear through magic. It accumulated because the system combined cost advantage, competitor elimination, and centralized control. Yet the backlash kept building. The Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890 created legal tools to challenge monopolies, and investigative journalism intensified public outrage by explaining how the machine actually worked. Ida Tarbell's reporting laid out secret rebates, predatory pricing, and coercive methods in a way ordinary people could understand, turning the monopoly from an abstract complaint into a concrete set of tactics. In 1911, the Supreme Court ruled that Standard Oil was an illegal monopoly and ordered it broken into dozens of separate companies. In the standard morality tale, that ruling is the moment justice wins and monopoly dies. In Rockefeller's story, it became another demonstration of how the method survives punishment. Rockefeller still owned major shares across the pieces, so the breakup did not sever his financial claim. When the fragments began operating and trading separately, markets valued them more richly than they had valued the single consolidated entity, and the combined value of the pieces rose above the original whole. Several of the successor firms later became giants whose names still define the energy world, including companies that evolved into Exxon, Mobil, Chevron, and others that fed into Amoco and later BP. The narrative emphasizes that the breakup did not restore a truly competitive landscape. It often created a set of regional dominators, and oligopoly conditions persisted under new corporate labels. Over the next century, mergers and consolidation gradually pulled many of those descendants back together, demonstrating how the system can retreat when regulators strike and then reconverge when attention fades. Exxon and Mobil merged in 1999. Chevron absorbed other major assets and descendants, and BP acquired significant pieces tied to the old Standard Oil ecosystem. The point is not that mergers are always a secret conspiracy. It is that the incentives of scale, capital, and infrastructure push many industries toward a small number of giants. Once a market rewards dominance, dominance tends to reappear even if courts temporarily force fragmentation. Standard Oil. The company was dismantled, but Standard Oil, the logic kept rebuilding itself because the logic is profitable and reproducible. From this point, the narrative jumps to the present and insists that Rockefeller's true legacy is not which energy companies still exist, but the toolkit dominant firms now use across sectors. Amazon is presented as the clearest modern parallel because its expansion mirrors Rockefeller's obsession with controlling every link in the chain. Amazon began as an online bookstore, then moved into warehousing, logistics, delivery capacity, payment infrastructure, and cloud computing until it became less a store than a privately built rail network for retail. The script stresses Amazon Web Services because it is not merely a side business. It is a critical infrastructure layer that hosts enormous parts of the internet, including services used by firms that compete with Amazon's commerce empire. Rockefeller gained leverage by controlling transport around refining. Amazon gains leverage by controlling both physical delivery and digital infrastructure around retail. Amazon is also framed as practicing horizontal power through acquisition and platform dominance. It buys competitors when possible, absorbing markets and capabilities. And when it cannot buy, it can replicate, undercut, and bury using platform advantage. The narrative highlights how third-party sellers provide sales data through the marketplace, allowing Amazon to identify winning products, launch private label equivalents, and then promote those equivalents through placement and logistics perks. The modern version of a kerosene price war does not always require slashing prices publicly. It can be a quiet shift in search rankings, a shipping badge that boosts conversion, or preferential exposure that drains rivals gradually. The method remains recognizable because distribution is controlled by the same entity that competes inside the marketplace, which is a modern form of the same chokehold Rockefeller created with rail and storage. Google is used to illustrate how the old trust model evolved into the modern holding company structure. Alphabet functions as a parent that owns Google Search, YouTube, and numerous other subsidiaries, centralizing strategic control while separating operations in ways that can shield liability and complicate regulation. The narrative adds a modern advantage Rockefeller never had. A monopoly can become more complete when users perceive the product as free. If the payment is data and attention rather than dollars, dominance can expand without triggering the same consumer backlash. Network effects and defaults keep users inside the system, and the cost of switching grows over time as habits, accounts, and social connections become anchored. In that framing, the dominance is not merely economic. It is behavioral, and behavioral monopolies can be harder to challenge because people feel they are choosing them voluntarily. Pharmaceutical companies are introduced as another field where Rockefeller's method appears, particularly through the capture of standards and regulators. Rockefeller did not only defeat competitors in open markets, he sought to shape the environment in which competition was allowed to exist. The narrative argues modern pharma achieves similar influence through patents, lobbying, relationships with regulators, and the shaping of professional guidelines. When regulatory processes are expensive and complex, incumbents benefit because barriers to entry rise, and the same complexity that protects safety can also protect market power. The script points to user fees, revolving doors, and regulatory dependence on industry expertise as mechanisms that can blur the line between oversight and partnership. In this framing, controlling the rulebook becomes as decisive as controlling manufacturing. Banking and finance are portrayed through the lens of corporate structure, because large banks operate as holding companies with layers of subsidiaries that can make enforcement difficult. JP Chase is presented as an example of a parent entity that owns major lines of business under one umbrella, and other banking giants operate similarly. The narrative argues that after crises, regulators face a maze. Where does risk truly sit? Where does strategy truly originate? And which entity can be meaningfully restrained when power is distributed across affiliated companies? Rockefeller's trust model anticipated this complexity by centralizing control while dispersing operational visibility. A system that makes power hard to locate often makes power hard to discipline, which becomes part of its defense. Then comes the most socially important component of Rockefeller's legacy: philanthropy as power technology. In 1913, Rockefeller created the Rockefeller Foundation with an enormous gift, publicly framed as generosity and social improvement through research, education, and public health. The narrative does not deny that foundations can fund real advances, because they absolutely can. The point is that tax-exempt philanthropy can also preserve wealth, reduce tax exposure, and buy legitimacy, turning a despised monopolist into a celebrated benefactor. A foundation can decide which universities thrive, which disciplines expand, which research agendas become orthodox, and which policy frameworks acquire prestige. That influence compounds because funded institutions train professionals. Professionals create standards, and standards shape markets, meaning philanthropy can quietly guide society's trajectory while looking like pure kindness. The script argues that Rockefeller's foundation helped reshape American medical education and public health priorities through funding and institutional influence, emphasizing laboratory science and pharmaceutical intervention as the dominant model. It frames this not as secret ritual, but as structural consequence. Money changes institutions, institutions change norms, and norms change what products and services dominate. From there, the narrative draws a line to modern billionaire philanthropy, where foundations and philanthropic vehicles combine real charitable work with tax advantages, legacy management, and policy influence at global scale. The Gates Foundation is cited as a modern parallel because it can shape global health initiatives and influence policy priorities through grant-making power, and other billionaire philanthropic projects are presented as variations on the same model. Rockefeller did not invent charity, but in this telling, he professionalized it into a durable pillar of elite influence. Rockefeller's personal death in 1937 did not weaken the system because the system was not dependent on his body. The narrative uses later Rockefeller descendants and institutions to illustrate how wealth and influence can persist through trusts, foundations, and elite networks. David Rockefeller's long career in high finance and his roles in influential policy circles are presented as evidence that the family's institutional footprint outlived the original oil empire. The deeper point is that once power is encoded into legal entities and institutional structures, it becomes infrastructure. And infrastructure is hard to remove. You can dislike a founder and still live in the architecture he normalized, because the architecture becomes the default design for everyone who follows. At the everyday level, the script insists the system is designed to feel like choice while functioning like containment. You believe you are selecting among brands, but many industries narrow into a handful of dominant players whose incentives align and whose methods converge. You can theoretically opt out of a platform or a supply chain, but the costs of avoidance rise because integrated giants make alternatives less convenient, less visible, and often more expensive. You can choose a different search engine, but network effects and default settings make it difficult to match scale. You can avoid a social platform, but social life and professional life can be routed through the same few corporate networks. You can resist pharmaceutical medicine, but licensing standards, insurance reimbursement, and cultural expectations shape what care is accessible and what care is treated as legitimate. In that framing, escape is not just a personal preference. It collides with infrastructure that has already been consolidated. To make extraction feel concrete, the narrative suggests that large portions of an ordinary person's spending flow toward firms using Rockefeller-style dominance, because necessities are the easiest places to collect tolls. Fuel, healthcare, consumer goods, and digital services are recurring expenses, and recurring expenses compound into enormous lifetime transfers. Even when unit prices look low, the aggregate flow is large precisely because the system sits on what people cannot easily stop buying. The argument is not that every dollar is stolen, but that the structure is designed so that most dollars travel through choke points owned by a small group. Once those choke points are owned, wealth concentrates almost automatically because the system collects a tiny toll from everyone, every day, at scale. At the same time, the narrative concedes something important. The Rockefeller method is powerful partly because it is efficient. vertical integration can genuinely reduce costs by eliminating markups and coordination failures. Consolidation can reduce duplication and smooth supply. Stable regulation can encourage investment, and philanthropic funding can accelerate research. Standard Oil did make kerosene dramatically cheaper than it had been during the chaotic early years of the oil business, and modern giants do provide undeniable convenience, whether that is rapid delivery, instant information access, reliable fuel supply, or effective medical interventions. The problem is not that the system fails to produce value. The problem is that it produces value while concentrating ownership and influence, so the consumer benefits and the controlling class benefits far more, compounding advantage into permanence. Near the end, the script shifts into how people react once they recognize the pattern, and it treats the reactions as psychological as much as political. Some accept the system as the natural endpoint of scale-driven capitalism and focus on using its conveniences while emotionally adjusting to inequality. Others resist by supporting antitrust enforcement, choosing smaller firms even when it costs more, and voting for political movements that prioritize competition over frictionless efficiency, even if that resistance introduces friction into daily life. A third posture is pragmatic positioning, which means understanding where value flows and refusing to remain naive about the incentives, while recognizing that this is not personal financial instruction so much as pattern recognition. Rockefeller's genius was owning the choke point that everyone else had to pass through, because the toll was collected invisibly and repeatedly. And the story implies that modern capitalism still rewards choke point ownership above almost anything else. The conclusion returns to Rockefeller's worldview through the line that compresses his philosophy into one provocative phrase: competition is a sin. In the narrative, that sentence is not treated as a casual boast, but as a sincere belief about waste, duplication, and disorder. Rockefeller saw consolidation as righteousness because it created efficiency, and he used efficiency as both justification and weapon. The story argues that modern markets have drifted toward that same endpoint, where 3 to 5 dominant firms often define an entire sector. Barriers to entry rise each year, and consolidation continues because the rules and incentives reward it. Standard Oil was broken up, but the method became more resilient after that breakup because it stopped being confined to one company. It became embedded in corporate law, regulatory practice, lobbying culture, institutional philanthropy, and the logic of modern finance, which is why the narrative insists you do not merely live in an economy with big corporations. You live inside a blueprint that was proven in oil, perfected in logistics and finance, and normalized so thoroughly that it feels like the natural shape of reality.